Stopping, so that was good. I feel like I should actually be talking about something totally different, given what transpired in Scotland yesterday. However, I did not prepare a talk on the Scottish referendum, but we can all talk about that later, because it is, of course, very interesting and very relevant to thinking about all sorts of questions in Europe. But what I am going to talk about today is some research that I've been doing with a co-author of mine in Germany, most generally sort of looking at the relationship between parties and voters. And this is a piece of this today, a new piece that we've been working on that I'll be talking about, and I look forward to your comments and questions after or during, as you see fit. Okay, so just to sort of start out, our sort of premise is, right, is that parties matter, right? That parties are an important institution in democracies, that they link citizens and governments by listening, by responding, and if they don't, then we end up with things like this, right? So things like new parties, right? Like the German Green Party, right? That formed in the early 1980s as a response to the unresponsiveness of the existing parties at the time, right? And more recently, right, we've been seeing parties like these, right? Like the Pirate Party, the Alternative for Germany, the Feminist Initiative, Golden Dawn, right? These are parties that are have recently formed when the existing parties, right, don't offer options for voters, and often that means that they're not responding and they're not listening, right? And so we see this sort of project kind of comes out of this idea that parties form this important linkage, and when they don't, right, we see citizens and we see other elites sort of taking charge and doing forming new parties. So just to kind of, that sort of sets up where this is coming from. Sorry, I hope you can read this with the glare. Okay. Where the sort of literature is on this is kind of in two places. One is looking at party positions, something called sort of party voter congruence. In other words, if the voters move left, the parties move left, right? So looking specifically at issue position. And there's a whole lot of work, I could list lots more citations of folks like Jim Adams and his co-authors that have looked at this. What I have done with my co-author and some other recent research is to look not at position as much, but looking at salience. In other words, what explains what issues parties emphasize, not what position they take necessarily, but what influences what they pay attention to, right? And so we've done some research and we've looked at, and those of you in the graduate class were subjected to reading a little bit of this. We've looked at this issue in several different contexts, and we find that party size and party type matters, right? So in terms of how responsive parties are to voters, it depends on the size of the party. If the party is a niche party or a mainstream party, and if it's in government or not. We've also looked at electoral context, right? We find that parties are actually more responsive in national elections than they are in European elections, right? And for those of you familiar with the second order literature, you're the technician. I think we got it figured out.
All right.
We used my computer.
Yeah, we never got it to work on the Mac, so we used a different computer. But the Mac thing's going to be an issue later. You may hear from us again.
We'll have them connect the Mac test maybe.
That'd be great. Thanks.
All right.
Sorry, Dave.
Okay, so the electoral context, right? The parties are going to be more responsive in the national elections than they are in European elections, and other work has shown that party organization, so internal party dynamics, is going to influence how responsive are the parties in terms of how responsive, they are to voters. So the question, though, that remains, and this is where this is a test of concentration. Where this paper comes in and this talk comes in is sort of opening the black box of government, right? So we've looked at sort of government versus opposition. We actually find that opposition parties are more responsive. They can be more flexible, whereas government parties don't have that luxury. And so what we're interested, though, is does the type of government matter, right? And what we do in this paper is looking at coalition governments specifically, right? And looking at the dynamics of coalition governments and how that influences how responsive parties are to voters. Okay, so where do we start from, right? So we start from sort of two different literatures. We start from the party competition literature as well as the coalition literature. So we're bridging the gap here between the two. And from the party competition literature, and this is probably familiar to many of you, right? We've got different perspectives on sort of the relationship between sort of parties and voters, right? The first is sort of the classic approach from Downs and others, which is the spatial idea, right? Voters move, parties follow, right? Parties are vote seeking, they want to win votes, voters move their positions, then parties follow, right? Obviously, this raises all sorts of issues from a credibility perspective because parties can be accused of flip-flopping, right? If they just go where the voters go, what do the parties really stand for? Another perspective is the issue emphasis idea, right? The parties are going to emphasize certain issues on which they have competencies, right? So environmental parties may focus on environmental issue, conservative parties may focus on economy, etc. And following from this is this idea of riding the wave, right? The parties are going to ride the wave of the voters, right? So they are paying attention to voters, and they're going to focus on issues on which they focus based on what the voters need. Okay? So we are interested, as I said before, in sort of looking at this in the context of coalition governments. Okay? So we're specifically looking at that in this talk today and in this project. Obviously, it would be interesting to compare coalition governments to single-party governments. That obviously could be a next iteration of this. But we're really interested in sort of opening that box of coalitions and sort of trying to understand the dynamics of how that influences responsiveness. So obviously, we all know coalition governments are just governments composed of more than one party, and this is obviously a very typical form of government in most European democracies, except for Greece and Spain and the UK. Usually, obviously, the UK currently has a coalition government, but typically, right, this is sort of the norm in European democracies. Sure. Okay, so the other thing to sort of obviously remember with coalition governments is that they're always sort of facing the potential of early dissolution, right? You have multiple parties that have campaigned on multiple issues, they may not always agree, so there's always this potential of early government breakdown, right? And we've seen that in France, not quite breakdown, but some activity going on in the government in France because of disagreements among the coalition members, right? So this is the challenge of obviously governing in with multiple parties. Okay, so there are two general kind of approaches to thinking about coalitions, okay, and sort of models of coalition governments. And so we sort of look at these two. The first one we talk about is in what we call the collegial model. Okay, and this is building on a lot of literature that's making this argument that cabinets are focused on the collective, right? This is where we get the idea of collective cabinet responsibility, okay? That the cabinet is the locus of decision making. It's not the individual parties themselves. We'll get to the second one, that's at the bottom here. And so the cabinet in coalition government is focused on intra-party bargaining and coordination. And then parties use a variety of control mechanisms, things like ministries, committee assignments, to keep partners in line, right? To keep everyone sort of in agreement, okay? So that's sort of the one model of coalition governance. And the second is where the focus is on the individual party and not on the collective cabinet. So it's focused on ministerial autonomy, okay? That portfolio owners can make independent decisions as long as they don't interfere or step on the feet, right, of other policy areas of other partners. So it's much more focused on the individual party and what's best for the party and not the cabinet itself, okay? So this is the ministerial model, right, focused on the party as the actor as opposed to the cabinet, okay? And we argue that these different models, we will have different expectations for how parties respond. Okay, so that's what we're focusing on here. So in the first model, if parties will focus on consensual issues. Okay, they're going to focus on issues in which there's agreement across cabinet members, even if it means ignoring the voters. Okay, so yes, they got into office because they appealed to some voters, but this model basically says that what matters here is keeping the cabinet together, so that actually they're going to ignore the people that got the vote. Because the goal is to avoid conflict, is to keep everyone together, okay? The ministerial model says actually that parties may focus on divisive issues, right? Issues on which not everyone is in agreement if they hold the ministry. So that's what's important. And they're going to respond to voters if the issues are under their jurisdiction, okay? Again, because it's about the individual party as opposed to the cabinet as a whole, okay? And so these obviously lead to two very different expectations that we sort of put up against each other in the collegial model and the ministerial model of party responsiveness. So just the first one reiterates effectively what I just said, which is that coalition parties' responsiveness to voters decreases as divisiveness increases. Okay, so as a cabinet gets more divided on a certain issue, they're going to any given party in that cabinet is going to respond less. And the other says that coalition parties are going to respond and be more responsive in the jurisdictions of the ministerial portfolios that they control than in the ones that they don't. Okay, so if I am a Green Party and I have the environment ministry, I am going to be more responsive to voters on that issue. Okay? All right, so that's kind of a lot of information, I realize, and if you have any questions, of course, I can go over all of that in the question and answer. But that's kind of where we're coming from on this, sort of building this theory. All right, so how do we do this? All right, so this may be or may not be interesting, depending on your perspective. I'm going to sort of walk through the design of this, all of the data that we collected, because this required a lot of different data sources in order to do this. Okay, so I guess before I start here, the one thing that I will sort of preface this with, and those of you that saw the paper saw this, is that the goal of this is to look across countries and over time. Okay, and so that obviously sets us up with a lot of data that we can use, but of course is limiting in other ways, right? There are certain things we can't do when we're looking at, and I'll get to the details in a minute, but looking at 16 parties over 40 years and in so many different elections. Okay, so there's obviously sort of weighing the pros and cons of what we want to do. And the idea here was obviously looking over time across parties, across elections, to really come up with a generalizable idea of the relationship between parties and voters in the context of coalition governments. Okay, so we by all means recognize that there are different ways of doing this, and as I'm talking, you may think, oh, but wait, you could look at this, you could look at that. Obviously, those are all possibilities, but the goal that we had was sort of this cross-national. Okay, so in order to do this, first we have to talk about how we measure party issue attention, right? So if we're thinking about like how we measure what issues parties focus on, we use the comparative manifestos data, which many of you in this room I'm sure are familiar with, but if you're not, just sort of briefly, this is a very good data source that collects the manifestos, codes the manifestos of political parties over time, actually from 1945 to the present, and enables us to do this kind of cross-national research. Okay, so this is where we pull that variable from, and I'll get into some of the details more in a minute. The dependent variable then is how much of the manifesto or the platform is devoted to a specific issue area. Okay, and so when we talk about issue areas, we're talking about things, broad issue areas like the environment, education, the economy, things like that. Okay, and again, I'll show you more of that in a minute. So that's how we're looking at parties. Okay, we're looking at parties from the manifestos and inferring responsiveness by looking at what the voters are thinking and then how the parties respond. Okay, and so how do we look at what the voters are thinking? We use a question that has, good for us and for anyone who studies this, that is asked on most national election surveys, which is what, when you go and vote, okay, or when you voted, depending if it's before or after the election, what was the most or what is the most important issue when you cast or when you cast a ballot? Okay, so it's an open-ended question and allows voters to be able to say everything from very specific to very general, and then we obviously have to look at all of this open-ended responses and pull things together. So things, everything that talks about the economy or things that talk about education or the environment, right? So that we can kind of look across different issues. The data that we use for this is the comparative study of electoral systems. And then where we needed to fill in and go back, we looked at national election studies, okay, in various countries. Okay, so then now we have these two different data sets. Now we need to match the responses, okay, between what the voters are saying and how the issues are coded in the comparative manifestos data. And what we do is we do this in 7 issue areas. Okay, and not that I expect anyone to be reading this, but just I'll tell you what it says. You can believe me. For those that are interested, so these are the 7 issue areas. Okay, so agriculture, civil rights, education, environment, etc. Okay? Part of the reason that we narrowed it down to these issues, because and you may be thinking, well, there's some things that seem to be glaringly missing, is that we wanted to be able to match them to ministries. Okay? So you might be thinking, well, the EU is not here, right? Why? How come you're not looking at the European Union as an obviously very important issue in European cabinets? Absolutely. The problem is that there is not one ministry that addresses issues concerning the EU, right? In some countries, it's the Justice Ministry. In other countries, it may be 3 or 4 different ministries. So it wasn't clear how to match that. So for that reason, we don't have the European Union, because we wanted to be able to look at, right, is a party more responsive on the environment issue, for example, if they have the environment ministry. Okay, so that sort of led to some of our decisions in terms of that. Okay, so these are, so the way that the manifestos data works, if you're not familiar with it, is on a given issue, for most issues, there is a left side and a right side. Okay, more integration, less integration. Right, more welfare expansion, less welfare expansion. Right, things like that. Because we're interested in salience and not position, what we did was we summed the two together. Okay, so on social welfare, we summed those that were more of a left-wing position, talking about welfare expansion, social justice, with those more of a right position. Okay, welfare state limitation. Okay, and that's how we ended up summing these two together, getting that dependent variable of salience. Okay, and then obviously matching what the voters were saying. Okay, with that. We'll get back to the ministries in a second. Okay, so those are the two big pieces of the puzzle. The third is really what we're interested in, right? So coming back to coalition governments, which is our two hypotheses, right? About divisiveness and about portfolio control. So how do we measure those? So the divisiveness of the issue was measured in this way. So first we, so in terms of the divisiveness issue, we had to determine the position of the party. Right? So the way that we determine position, which is something that's commonly done with the manifestos data, is that we subtracted the right positions from the left positions. Okay? And that's how we got a given position on the environment or on social welfare, et cetera, for a given party. Okay? Then we looked at all of the positions on that given issue for the entire cabinet and took the range of those. Okay? So the bigger the range, right, the more divided the cabinet is. Okay? This is sort of following what Sabellis does in the veto players literature in terms of how to determine position of the cabinet and range of the cabinet. And then for the second variable, which is just portfolio control, right? Oops, sorry, getting everyone busy here. That's just if the party had the ministry or not. Okay, so does the party have the environment ministry, the health ministry, etc. Okay, so that's how we measure those two. And because we're looking at how those interact with voter salience, right, we're looking at two interaction terms. Okay? And so this is the whole list of sources where this came from, if you have any questions about any of them. So lots of data went into this project. Okay. So some other control variables, right, that obviously are also going to perhaps influence what is going on here and how responsive parties are things that I actually talked about before, things like party size, the left-right position of the party, whether it's a niche party or not, and if the party has the prime ministership, right? And so we have expectations for all of those in terms of more or less responsiveness. So larger parties are going to be more responsive, niche parties are going to be less responsive, etc. Okay? And then we have a couple of other control variables at the system level. Okay, so not just at the individual party level, and this is whether the government was a minority government and the district magnitude size. Right? We would expect the party to be less responsive, both in a minority government and as district magnitude increases. Okay? All right, so this results in this. 55 parties in 16 countries, 45 elections from 1972 to 2011. Okay, so lots of data, lots of time points, lots of things going on here. Again, because this idea of really wanting to understand more general patterns of what's happening. Okay, so we use just a straight up OLS regression because our dependent variable is a continuous variable of issue attention. We do cluster the standard variables, the standard errors, both on party and on issue, because for each party, they're in the data set multiple times for each issue. So each party in each election is in the data set 7 times, okay? Because we have 7 issues for each election, okay? And obviously, we have a lag-dependent variable because the party's issue attention at time t0 in the current election is obviously going to be influenced by the party's position, the party's salience in the last election, okay? So, all right, so that's the data and the research design. All right, now, you always gotta love these where you can now squint at what I put up here. But we'll draw your attention to the red in the middle, which is the variables that are of most interest. And of course, if you have questions later, we can go over some of the others. But what's highlighted here, of course, is the interaction effects, right? This is the first hypothesis about divisiveness. As divisiveness goes up, responsiveness is going to go down, and about portfolio control. Okay, so if the party has the portfolio, they're going to be more responsive on that issue. Okay, so even with all of the complicatedness of the data set, fairly straightforward questions and how we're testing that. 2 different models, one that has all of the interaction terms for all of these control variables and one that does not. Okay, and what you can see is that for the first hypothesis, right, we find a significant effect. Okay, so as divisiveness, right, as the coalition becomes more divided on a specific issue, the parties are going to ignore the voters, and if the voters care about the issue, and that will affect how much effort, or excuse me, how much emphasis they put on the issue. Okay, so they'll emphasize the issue less. Okay, and then over here, we're actually finding no significant effect for portfolio control. So although we may think that if a party has the portfolio, that they're going to be more likely to focus on that issue, we actually don't find evidence of that. Okay, so we're actually finding more evidence for this collegial model, right, the cabinet sort of centered idea of cabinet governance than for the other one. Okay, so this is just looking at all voters, and then we look at the second one at party supporters. Okay, so these are people that voted for the party in the last election that we call party supporters. Okay, again, there's of course lots of other ways of measuring support of a party, but given the constraints of what data that we were using, this is how we measured it. Okay, and looking at party supporters, we're again finding support for the collegial model, and we do find over here some support for the ministerial model when we look at party supporters. Okay, so that if a party has the ministry, they will listen to their supporters, and that will influence responsiveness. Okay, which makes sense, but obviously much less evidence for this. Okay, so some pictures that you don't have to squint at to basically make the same argument. So these are marginal effects plots. Okay, so this is just looking at the marginal effect of voter issue attention on party issue attention as divisiveness increases. And on the left is for voters, on the right for parties. Obviously, they look fairly similar, as the results I just showed you also look fairly similar, right? But this again makes this very clear that as we see more division, right, within the cabinet, the parties are going to be less responsive. Okay, and if you're curious, these sort of what looks like dirt on the bottom of the figures is the distribution of the independent variable. Okay, so we can see that there's much more divisiveness on this end than on the very divided end, right? And we also see more a stronger relationship on this end as well. Okay. All right. So for those of you that want some real specifics, I have real specifics for you. To sort of really kind of think about this in the terms of actual political parties. So I have a couple of examples just to sort of show you how this works kind of in practice. So this is looking at 2 different elections on the environment issue. Okay, and just sorry, going backwards for a second. So the environment issue. This is how the environment issue is measured. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the manifestos data, this is how it's measured, and this is how we put together that issue. Okay, so we've got one dimension that's an anti-growth dimension, right? So parties talking in a positive way about growth in a negative way. If that makes sense. And then sort of more of the valence issue of environmental protection, just that ideas about protecting the environment. And then on the other side, which is the flip side of the anti-growth, is a focus on productivity. And these have been shown in the literature, right? They're not shown, but these have been consistently used in the literature as a way of measuring the environment using the CNP data. Okay? And obviously there's limitations, of course. We can talk about that more as well. But this is what's sort of here in the standard. Sorry. Okay. All right. So first example here is the Netherlands in 2003. So in 2003, we had a coalition between the conservative Christian Democrats and two liberal parties, the VVD and D66. Okay. The salience among the electorate, okay, on the issue of the environment was slightly above the mean. Mean is about 10.6, so a little bit higher than the mean. Conflict in the cabinet was quite high. The mean is about 5.5. Okay, so conflict in the cabinet was quite high, meaning there was a lot of different among the three parties. Right, there were different positions on these different issues. In this next election, okay, so something I may have skipped over in terms of how we measured this was looking at what the manifesto looks like at T0 based on what the voters are doing, what the cabinet looked like at T-1. Okay, so basically parties responding to what happened in the previous time period. Now you may be thinking, well, a lot happens in that time period. Absolutely. But again, we're trying to be consistent looking at national election studies over time, and also recognize the fact that parties don't just write the manifestos a week before the election, right? They're writing them several years, oftentimes several years in the making, and so that what voters thought about a couple of years before is not that far in the past. And obviously that can influence the current state of the government because as they're working on it as well. Okay, so then in 2006, right, which is then the next election, the VVD, which is one of the liberal parties, issue attention was only 4.4%, which means 4.4% of their manifesto focused on the environment. Okay, and again, those numbers might not mean a whole lot, but we can compare it to Germany and then see the difference. Okay, so 1990 in Germany, we had a coalition between the Christian Democrats and the liberal party, the FDP. Salience, very similar. Conflict, half. Okay, so much less division between the CDU and the FDP than there was in the Netherlands. And then we see in 94 that issue attention is more than twice as large. Okay, so the FDP's manifesto in 1994, almost 11% focused on the environment. Okay, so just focusing on the differences here, we see that when voters care about things, even if it's similar in two different countries, right, in two different instances, that the conflict within the governing cabinet coalition really has an effect on how much attention the party pays to the issue. Okay, so perhaps ignoring the voters here, focusing more on what the voters care about here. Okay, so this really highlights what's going on inside the coalition. All right, so this obviously is not showing us anything that amazing. What this is showing us is that there is really no statistical difference in terms of having the portfolio or not having the portfolio, right? So confidence intervals are totally overlapping, right? We see a little bit of a difference over here with party supporters, okay? But basically this is just showing in a visual way the idea that just having the ministry does not necessarily make a party more responsive, okay? So again, this is just more evidence, or a different way of showing that evidence that it really is about the collegial model. All right, so just to kind of conclude, and then I'm happy to have any questions and things that you guys may have. So just to sum up, obviously all of this evidence is showing that there's much stronger support for the collegial model than there is for the ministerial model. Okay, so as I've shown you a couple of different ways, as conflict over an issue increases, parties pay less attention, okay, often sometimes ignoring the voters. And holding the ministerial portfolio, even though we might expect that to have an influence, it actually doesn't, right? So that might be the maybe the most surprising finding, or counterintuitive finding. And sort of, oops, sorry, crashing the wall. And perhaps, you know, what we really want to kind of take away from this and talk about this for a few minutes, sort of going back to where we started from, which is this has implications that matter, as most things do. And the first is between party competition and coalition governments, right? So again, sort of looking at this challenge of campaigning on things, wanting to be responsive to voters, and then the challenge of then being in government with parties that may not necessarily agree with you, right? And sort of trying to figure out from a party's perspective, what's most important in terms of who to listen to, right? The voters or all of my other cabinet coalition partners, and basically not wanting to rock the boat and end the government, which could get me out of a job, or get the party out of a job, right? So it's kind of putting these two things, recognizing that these are things that parties are being pulled in two different directions, right? On the one hand, wanting to be responsive to voters, on the other hand, being office seeking and wanting to stay in office, right? And so this really shows that there is that tension there. And finally, this does have implications for representation, right? This is what I started out with, talking about parties having this important linkage function. And if you just sort of think about the idea that voters, you typically, not always, but typically will vote for a party that they agree with in some way. They may have strong partisanship, it might be about an issue, etc. But then if the party gets into the cabinet, right, is governing with other parties, and is then not responsive to the voters that got them in, right, the next time around, they may not actually get reelected, right? So it's not that not that the cabinet perhaps has ended early because of divisions within the cabinet, but by following this idea of a consensus model of governing, this could hurt them in the future. And possibly this may have more implications for smaller parties, right? Smaller parties or niche parties, which are often small, though not always, right? If this is the case that they get into government, right, which is what many of them are striving for, then work with the larger parties, but then are not responding to their own voters because they want to stay in government, their own voters may then not vote them in again the next time. So they may actually find themselves in the same position had they responded to a divided issue, right? So this presents some interesting challenges for parties. I'll leave it there. And any questions you have would be great.
Well, thank you. And before we have formal questions, as many of you know, this speaker series is associated with a graduate course on European integration. And so for those students who are in the class, as part of their privilege and responsibility, being class members, is to serve as a discussant once during the semester. So our first discussant of